So I'm afraid I will be using PowerPoint. I also am afraid I won't be talking about the ethics of using beagles to sniff out cancer or the development of artificial noses, or I think that would be a great topic to look at. So how do I change the... Is this it here? Okay. So I'll be talking about the ethics of negotiating access to medicines for rare cancers. I won't spend very much time on the introductory few slides because we've been through this a number of times already. But we'll just talk very briefly about what is a rare cancer, then talk about who wants access to medicines for rare cancers, who provides access at the moment, and I'll spend most of the time focusing on why decisions about access to medicines for rare cancers can be so difficult. So my goal today is, in giving you a talk that we're calling an ethical perspective, is not to tell you what's right and wrong about anything, but rather to show you how complex some of the issues are, and think about some ways we might negotiate that complexity. And then think about what some of the implications of that might be for rare cancer advocacy. So what is a rare cancer? Just very quickly to remind you, we're talking here about cancers that occur uncommonly, obviously. In Australia, the most commonly used definition is less than 6 per 100,000 people. Rare cancers can be rare for a number of reasons. So they can be rare because they arise in an unusual site in the body, or they can be a biologically unusual variant of a more common cancer, or sometimes they can be defined as cancers that need specific treatments. We've already heard at the beginning of the day today that over 44,000 Australians will be diagnosed with a rare cancer in a given year, and about half of those will die. And importantly, there's been little change in the incidence to mortality ratios for rare cancers over the past 20 years. So that's just setting the scene for some of the ethical issues I'll discuss. In terms of who wants access to medicines for rare cancers, well, I certainly don't need to go into that here because everyone in this room is advocating for access to rare cancers. But, can I go back? But just to remind you of the fact that a lot of our systems for funding medicines have been reviewed recently. So there's been a review of our life-saving drugs program and an inquiry into the funding of high-cost cancer medicines. And advocates for rare cancers have had a voice in those processes. So, for example, when it came to the review of the life-saving drugs program, the argument was made that that program should be tailored so that it actually is useful for people with rare cancers. At the moment, there are no cancers that are covered through that program. And in terms of the recent Senate inquiry into new innovative and specialised cancer drugs, the point was made that cancer patients have suffered from, or some cancer patients have suffered from years of systematic neglect, and that there's a need for new ways of thinking about how we fund cancer medicine. So not just doing more of the same, or even just tweaking the systems we've got, but actually coming up with profoundly different ways of thinking about how we might give people access to cancer medicines. So at the moment, there are a number of ways that people can get access to cancer medicines. This is not specific to rare cancers, it's cancers in general. So patients can access medicines if they're funded on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. There are also a number of special government programs. As I said, the life-saving drugs program currently doesn't fund cancer medicines, but in theory it could. And there's, for example, the Herceptin program, which provides access to a particular targeted cancer therapy for a particular indication that's not covered on the PBS. Patients can also access cancer medicines through at the hospital level, so through hospital therapeutics committees when clinicians go in and advocate for them. Sometimes they can get medicines from pharmaceutical companies through various compassionate access schemes. Some people get access to medicines through trials, although you have to be a little bit careful about thinking of that as a form of access, given that at least 50% of people who enroll in a trial won't, by definition, get access, and there is this concern that some people think that they are going to get access to a new therapy by virtue of being enrolled in a trial. And sometimes, if individuals are lucky enough to be able to afford medicines themselves, then they can pay for them. So, given that so rare cancers and cancer in general is such a problem and so many people want access to these medicines, why has this not happened? Why is this so difficult? And none of the issues that I'm going to talk about now are new, and they've probably all been mentioned along the course of the day so far, but I just thought I would try and give you a bit of a more systematic way of thinking about some of the issues. So why are they so difficult? Well, I think decisions about access to cancer medicines are difficult because we need to consider a number of different values whenever we make these decisions. And not only that, but these values can be very particularly difficult to fulfill when it comes to cancer, and even more difficult when it comes to rare cancers. And then to make matters even more complicated, these values will often compete and conflict with each other. So in trying to achieve one, we become less able to achieve another. So I'll just take you through what I see to be some of these values and value dilemmas that we face in this context. So first of all, the sort of basis of all ethics is the desire to do good and not do any harm. And that, when it comes to cancer medicines, is always a balancing act. Related to that, and particularly relevant in this context, is this principle called the rule of rescue, which is this idea that there's an imperative to help people who are in desperate situations, irrespective of what it might cost and irrespective of how uncertain we might be about benefit. And sometimes that's framed as a moral imperative, and sometimes it's framed as a psychological imperative. So sometimes it's something we think we should do, and sometimes it's something we think we just have to do. We can't help but feel the need to do it. So, of course, as much as we might want to always do good and avoid harm, we can't always achieve that, and that's for the simple reason that treatments for cancers in general and rare cancers are unfortunately not always as safe and effective as we want them to be, and there's nothing unique about cancer in that regard. But it is important to bear in mind that when it comes to cancers, a lot of drugs are approved on the basis of what are called surrogate outcomes, so not actual clear evidence that life is extended or that quality of life is improved. So we often don't know exactly how beneficial these treatments are. And there was just a paper published in JAMA Internal Medicine this month which talked about how many cancer drugs are approved on the basis of surrogate outcomes. So that's things like tumor shrinkage or progression, survival without tumor progression. And importantly, these drugs may be toxic as well as beneficial. Another principle that's actually been raised, I think, many, many times already today is the principle of equity, which is basically the desire to address unjust inequalities in society. And it's to address unjust inequalities that can be addressed, so not to try and address things that are unavoidable, but where things can be addressed, the principle of equity says that you should. And I think that the fact that about 50% of cancers fall into the category of rare cancers, but only about 15% of PBS funds are currently dedicated to rare cancers is a very good illustration of the problems we have achieving equity in this context. Now, equity is a really nice principle, and it's easy to talk about as something we should aspire to, but it is actually quite difficult to achieve in practice. The reality is that resources will always be limited, and some people will always miss out relative to others, which is not to say that you shouldn't try and look for inequalities and address them wherever you can, but there'll always be inequalities. And I think one interesting issue is what effect on equity the personalization of cancer therapy will have. So we heard this morning that ultimately, when every single cancer is viewed as a rare cancer, perhaps only affecting one person, that'll have a democratizing effect. Everyone will be the same because everyone will have a rare cancer. But until that happens, I think equity is going to be a constantly moving field. So whereas it might have been quite straightforward to say, well, patients with duodenal cancer are disadvantaged relative to patients with lung cancer, now you can't say that anymore because there are some patients with very rare variants of lung cancer who might do worse than patients with duodenal cancer. So equity is just, you can't just throw it out there as a concept that doesn't need to be unpacked in a particular context. So I've given you a few examples there of a fairly common cancer like non-small cell lung cancer. There is one variant of that which about 1% of people have, which responds to a particular personalized therapy. So that is a very rare variant of a common cancer. Another reason that it's difficult to achieve equity of access is because of the current systems we have in place. So if a drug is on the PBS, then chances are it'll be distributed to everybody in the population who meets certain criteria. But when it comes to these other funding mechanisms, that's not the case. So modes of access will always depend, equity of access will always depend on who has access to clinical trials and who's eligible for clinical trials. We want to put everyone on trials. We've heard that a few times today, but not everybody has that opportunity. Similarly, not everybody is deemed to be eligible for industry compassionate access programs. Not everybody has doctors who can advocate for them to the same extent for special approval through hospital drug committees. And of course, not everybody has money to buy the medicines themselves in the absence of any of the above mechanisms. Another group of principles it's a massive, massive issue, and I'm just lumping them all together for the purposes of this talk, and that's that we need to think about, whether we like it or not, we need to think about principles like efficiency, affordability, and fairness of price, so the economics of paying for medicines. So one way of phrasing that is that we want to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but we want to do so in a manner that is affordable, and we also want to pay a fair price for medicines that are based on their clinical value. I'm not a health economist, so I can't give you all the details about how the complexities of these issues, but basically it can be very difficult to distribute resources efficiently and in an affordable way when it comes to rare cancers. We've heard already today that these treatments are often very expensive. Their development is expensive because, for example, it takes a much longer time to recruit people to trials. Markets are small, so the unit prices of these drugs are often very high. And if you put all the rare cancers together, you've got a collectively large group of cancers. So even though each drug might be there might not be that many people with any single rare cancer. When you put them all together, the cost of treatments for rare cancers can be very high. And this leads to a situation where even medicines that are considered to be cost effective, so they meet a particular cost per quality adjusted life year threshold, for want of a better word, they just might not be affordable at a population level. It's also there's a lot of debate at the moment about what counts as a fair price for a medicine, and there's been a lot of media attention paid to that recently when a company bought a medicine and then increased the price of it by several 100% overnight, so a cheap drug became a very expensive drug. And there's a debate in the literature at the moment about how much it really costs to develop drugs. So some people contest this idea that it actually costs as much as some companies say it costs to develop drugs. So recently, the Tufts University Center for the Study of Drug Development estimated that it costs about more than $2 billion to develop a drug on average. And that included considerations of the risks that's taken in the development of the drug and the need to attract investment, and also all kinds of things were factored into that estimate. But a number of critics have said that that figure is not accurate, that it's overblown, that it does things like ignoring public investment in basic science and clinical research, by including marketing costs in so-called drug development costs, and by overstating the risks involved in drug development and what it actually takes to attract investment. And so some people would argue that the price of medicines has nothing to do with what it costs to develop a drug, but rather with what the market will bear. So that's just an ongoing debate. And of course, if you're in a small market like Australia, you have less bargaining power when it comes to the price of drugs as well. And then finally, the last principle that I think we have to consider is the presence of scientific evidence for the decisions we make. So ideally, when we make decisions about access to medicines, we want to make them on the basis of good scientific evidence of effectiveness, of safety, and of cost effectiveness. But as we've heard, we can't always get that evidence when it comes to drugs for rare cancers. And that's primarily because it's very difficult to do large randomized trials and then to do systematic reviews and meta-analyses of those trials. And there are a number of reasons for that. The most obvious one is that there just aren't often enough people to enroll in the trial to get the answer that you need. It's further complexified by the fact that these people are often desperately ill and either don't want to be part of a control group or potentially part of a control group, or they expect to be able to switch from one arm of the study to another if their disease progresses. And that's completely understandable from an ethical perspective, but it really gets in the way of the ability to generate answers from a trial. And then for targeted therapies, the trials become even more complicated because you have to factor in things like simultaneously evaluating companion diagnostics and figuring out which groups should be the comparators in clinical trials. So technically it's very, very complicated, but I think the people who've spoken already today have shown us that people are thinking about this very actively at the moment, and there are new methodological, new statistical techniques that are being developed all the time to try and deal with this, and also a push towards more gathering of evidence in the real world in recognition of the fact that perhaps we'll never get all the answers we need through randomized trials. But all of that means that at the moment it can be very difficult when it comes to rare cancers to show a regulator or a payer that the drug is without doubt effective, safe, and cost effective. So those are the values, I guess, just one at a time and showing you what they are and why they might be difficult to achieve. This slide is just meant to remind you of what I said earlier, which is that sometimes the better you get at achieving one value, the more you have to compromise on another. So a couple of examples of that is that sometimes if you're really focused on the clinical benefit of a drug, you might have to tolerate a higher level of toxicity. In order to achieve equity of access, you might have to compromise on efficiency, affordability, and your ability to negotiate a fair price. And if you want quick access to medicines, then you might have to make decisions on the basis of less than ideal evidence. So just one more slide to finish up. I think that the lessons for advocacy from this, when you start to think systematically about all the values that are at stake and the complexity, is that we should certainly be advocating for more access to medicines and for quicker access and for more money and so on. But I think it's also very important to recognise complexity and advocate not just for what you might call distributive justice, but also for procedural justice. So think about how you can make the processes as fair as possible, and that includes things like making sure that stakeholders are engaged in the process so that they can actually make sure that all the relevant values are being considered. Make sure that the processes are transparent so that people outside can see that the values are being considered systematically and that they're being balanced in a way that might be considered reasonable, even if not everyone agrees on a particular decision. And processes should have the people making decisions should be accountable for those decisions. Their decision making should be overseen, and the decisions should be appealable when people believe that they haven't been made with these principles in mind. So I'll leave it there. Okay.